A very stern message to those violent protesters.
To the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis who came to our beautiful state yesterday, there is no place for you here in Charlottesville. There is no place for you in Virginia. And there is no place for you in the United States of America. We deplore your hatred, your bigotry, and shame on you.
I want to bring us in as Rosa Flores, who's on the scene for us in Charlottesville right now. Rosa, first of all, tell us more about this victim. You were at a memorial for Heather Heyer a little while ago. What are you learning about this young woman, only 32 years old?
You know, Wolf, we are learning more about Heather Heyer. We know that she's 32 years old and that she was just from up the road, from about 17 miles from Ruckersville, Virginia, and she worked here in Charlottesville. She worked at the bankruptcy department of a law firm as a paralegal. In other words, she helped people find a new financial future. But I want to have you look behind me, because this is the street where a car plowed into a group of protesters. And of course, now we know that Heather Heyer has died from those injuries, and 19 other people were injured. Now, the latest that we're hearing from hospitals is that 10 of those people are still in good condition, and they are at the hospital. 9 others have been discharged. Now you can see that this memorial is growing. The outpour of support from this community has been growing all morning, people bringing in flowers and messages. Now earlier today we were at a church service where the governor, Terry McAuliffe, spoke very bluntly about the individuals involved here, calling them white supremacists and saying that this is an exhibition of hate and that these people do not belong in this city and in this state. And the congregation there taking his words very seriously, but here's what they did not like. The congregation didn't like the message from the President of the United States. Take a listen.
The message that was sent out from number 45 was very much inadequate. I didn't feel it had compassion. I didn't feel it spoke for not only people of color, but for anyone that are going through, people that are suffering. I think he divides and doesn't bring us together. And the biggest part for me, the man just has no compassion, period. It really hurts, you know. More should have been said. You need to call it what it is and stop playing around with it. Call it out. We're hurting.
And as you take another live look here, that is the photo of Heather Heyer brought here to this memorial that keeps growing, Wolf, as the day goes by. There's been a lot of people coming here in solidarity with a lot of pain, a lot of grief, of course, asking for the support, not only from this town and from the city, but from around the country. Wolf?
A wonderful young woman killed, brutally killed in that horrific car assault. Rosa Flores, thanks very much. Tomorrow, the suspect in that car assault in Charlottesville, Virginia, will face a judge. That man now charged with second-degree murder, 20-year-old James Alex Fields Jr. from Ohio. The man's mother saying her son drove from Ohio to Charlottesville to take part in that rally that she thought had something to do with President Trump. That's what the mother says. Let's go to CNN's Brian Todd, who's covering all the late-breaking developments for us in Charlottesville. Brian, there was also a confrontation that occurred just a little while ago. Tell us about that.
Right, Wolf. It's a real illustration of just the escalating and percolating tensions here in Charlottesville that still exist a day after that rally. At this spot where I'm standing just moments ago, the organizer of that white supremacist rally, the Unite the Right rally, his name is Jason Kessler. He appeared right here at this spot. He wanted to hold a news conference right here in the shadow of City Hall here in Charlottesville. There were microphones set up. There were counter-protesters over here chanting. When Jason Kessler came out, he stood here for several minutes and started to talk into the microphones. Nobody could really hear what he said because people were screaming at him, drowning him out. There were musical instruments being played to drown him out. Then either the media or the crowd or both started to kind of get closer to Kessler and almost converge on him. We're not clear about what exactly happened that caused him to go down. He either fell or was pushed down. But at that point, the police quickly converged on the scene. Riot police in full riot gear got him out of here, around that corner, around the building, and into safety inside the police department, which is just kind of on the other side of this same building. So I believe we have some tape of that now that is showing some of that. As I walk down here toward a protest that is still going on. These are a group of counter-protesters behind me that are still here and chanting some things and making some speeches, again illustrating their real anger at the fact that Jason Kessler is still in this town, even after the governor and the mayor told him and all of his followers, get out of town, we don't want you here. He comes back here this afternoon to hold a news conference. He's drowned out, he falls, he gets taken out of here by the cops, and then you've got a lot of angry people still here. Our photojournalist Adolfo Ibarra is coming with me down here. There seems to be some tension here now. Some people yelling at each other and chanting things and confronting the police. I'll just try to get a look and see what's going on here. They seem to be shouting down a man over here. So there are police around us, and we're going to see how this plays out, but it seems to be a little more than a shouting match here, Wolf. But again, an illustration here of the enormous tension that has just converged upon Charlottesville yesterday, today, even back to Friday night with that torch march on the University of Virginia campus, Wolf. We also have some tape of the actual car crash, which really escalated this situation yesterday, that horrible car crash where the suspect, James Alex Fields, allegedly plowed into a group of protesters who were walking on 4th Street just a short way from me here, killing that 32-year-old woman, Heather Heyer, injuring several other people, striking other vehicles. Here's a look at some of the tape that we have put together about that incident. All right, and we've still got some angry protesters behind me here, chanting at each other, yelling at each other, yelling at the police. The police, if you can see a line of police over here, just kind of watching them. Again, not nearly what we saw yesterday, but still illustrating the tension here, Wolf. A lot of people in this town still very angry. They want the white supremacists out. Jason Kessler didn't get out. He came back here moments ago, and this is what has happened since then.
All right, Brian, we're going to stay in very, very close touch with you. You'll watch developments for us. We'll get back to you soon. Brian Todd on the scene for us. Earlier this morning, the mayor of Charlottesville was speaking out. He says he's holding the president of the United States responsible, at least in part, for the violence in his city, as part of his interview on CNN's State of the Union with Jake Tapper.
You said you place blame for these terrifying events, quote, right at the doorstep of the White House and the people around the president, unquote. That's a very strong charge to level. Why do you think the president himself bears responsibility?
Well, look at the campaign he ran. I mean, look at the intentional courting, both on the one hand of all these white supremacist, white nationalist group like that, anti-Semitic groups, and then look on the other hand, the repeated failure to step up, condemn, denounce, silence, put to bed all those different efforts.
This comes on the heels of growing backlash over the president's failure to specifically condemn white supremacists after the deadly attack. Meanwhile, some top members of the Republican Party aren't holding back in their condemnation. The House Speaker Paul Ryan, the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Senators Marco Rubio, Rob Portman, among many others. They are speaking out specifically against the bigotry, the hatred of the white supremacist groups. While the president faces tough criticism over his response to of the attack. His Homeland Security advisor in the White House, Tom Bossert, says the president's message called for respect and love among Americans. I want to bring in our White House correspondent, Athena Jones. She's joining us from Bridgewater, New Jersey, not far from where the president is spending his working vacation. First of all, do we know what the president is doing today, Athena? A beautiful Sunday up in New Jersey?
Hi, Wolf. Well, not so far. No word on what the president is doing. In fact, the press pool, the small pool of reporters assigned to follow him today, isn't even supposed to gather for several more hours. We've asked several times whether he's golfing. No word on that. It is a beautiful day for golf, but we don't have any word on that. We also haven't heard anything more from the president about this issue, Charlottesville, and what happened there, or any other issue at all today. But we did hear from the president's daughter, Ivanka Trump, who is, of course, one of his senior advisors. She took to Twitter several hours ago, tweeting this morning, "There should be no place in society for racism, white supremacy, and neo-Nazis. We must all come together as Americans and be one country, united." We also heard a couple of hours after that from a White House official who wouldn't give their name, but putting out a statement that went further than what we heard President yesterday. Here is that statement from the White House official. The president said very strongly in his statement yesterday that he condemns all forms of violence, bigotry, and hatred, and of course that includes white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazi, and all extremist groups. He called for national unity and bringing all Americans together. And of course, we have been stressing this point that we haven't heard those kinds of words coming from the president himself, despite the fact that this is a president who has been passionate about criticizing a long list of people, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, from Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Senator John McCain, a whole long list. He's called the media the enemy of the people, but groups he has not criticized explicitly are white nationalists, white supremacists, the KKK, etc. So a lot of folks want to hear these tough words from the president directly. Well,
have they explained, White House officials, maybe even, on background, what the president meant when he condemned, in his words, in the strongest possible terms, the egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides, the words "on many sides"? What did he mean by that?
Well, we asked that question repeatedly yesterday and did get a response from a White House official, essentially doubling down on what the president said. The statement from that official was along the lines of the president condemned the hatred, bigotry, and violence from all sources and all forms. And this official pointed out that there was violence from the counter-protesters and the protesters. And that is true. There was an outbreak of violence with the demonstrators and the counter-demonstrators. But this idea that all sides are responsible for the hatred and bigotry that was on display, that is something that a lot of folks have taken issue with, saying that the president is equating the KKK and the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists with the people who were out in the streets demonstrating against that kind of racism and hatred. Well,
and Republican Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado, he's specifically calling out the president in pointed words. Tell our viewers what he's saying.
Well, let's go ahead and play what Senator Gardner had to say about this on State of the Union this morning.
Well, this is not a time for vagaries. This isn't a time for innuendo or to allow room to be read between the lines. This is a time to lay blame on bigotry, to lay blame on white supremacists, on white nationalism, and on hatred. And that needs to be said. This president has done an incredible job of naming terrorism around the globe as evil, radical Islamic terrorism, whether it's in Europe or the Middle East. He has said and called it out time and time again, and this president needs to do exactly that today.
And you heard Senator Gardner say the president needs to come out and do that today. As I said, Wolf, we have no news of any planned statement from the president. We haven't heard anything from the president about this or any other issue today. And I should point out that Gardner is not alone. He is one of the first people who took to Twitter yesterday. I believe we have that tweet directing his message directly at the president, saying, "Mr. President, we must call evil by its name. These were white supremacists, and this was domestic terrorism. Gardner joined several other Republicans who have called on the president to be tougher. And Wolf, let's remind our viewers one reason this is so important, and that is that as a candidate, candidate Trump got a lot of support from the so-called alt-right or white nationalist movement. He was endorsed by the likes of David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, and he has been hesitant to outwardly denounce these groups. Soon after his election as president-elect in November, he gave an interview to the New York Times where he said he didn't want to energize this alt-right movement, that he disavowed them. But he hasn't been forceful and he hasn't repeated that disavowal recently at all. And this is, of course, someone who will repeatedly criticize people over and over on Twitter, but he hasn't had the same harsh rhetoric when it comes to these white nationalist and white supremacist groups. Well,
so basically, if the president is ready to clarify, make an additional statement, there are crews there, there's a pool of reporters, he could go out within a few minutes, he could make that statement. But,
absolutely, we are standing by.
From what I'm hearing from you, Athena, White House officials have not given you any indication he's about to do that.
Right, exactly. Well, but we are always here and ready in case he wants to.
Let's hope he does. All right, Athena Jones, thanks very much. Our next guest is Brennan Gilmore. Went to the Charlottesville area to protest against the white supremacists. He actually eyewitnessed the deadly car assault. He posted on Twitter these words. He said, "Let there be no confusion. This was deliberate terrorism." Brennan is joining us now. Brennan, thanks very much for joining us. You saw the moment that car plowed into that crowd, killing that one young woman. Describe what you saw.
Thank you, Wolf. I was here to protest against the Nazis that came to town with their hateful ideology. After the main protest had broken up, we moved to a side street, and there was a peaceful, non-violent march taking place of fellow protesters against racism. They were coming up a very narrow street here in Charlottesville, arm to arm. I was videotaping them as they were marching, and when I heard from behind me a car accelerating very fast down the street, I pulled back and filmed the video, which many have seen now, of the car deliberately targeting, lining up and then gunning the engine to do maximum damage on the crowd. He smashed into the crowd, bodies went flying, and then reversed to make his escape, sending people scurrying out of the way.
And the crowd in which this car plowed into that crowd, these were all, correct me if I'm wrong, what we're calling these counter-protesters, people who were out there to make it clear they didn't want white supremacists or neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. Is that right?
That's correct.
Was there any indication in advance something like this could happen? Were you given any warning, any indication, be careful?
Absolutely. The scene was very tense in Charlottesville, and of course there was violence that had broken out in the main protest site here in town. I was quite concerned that the situation was going to get violent as the day went on, particularly because of the amount of weapons. That you had the Nazis, these militias who were protecting them, who were dressed as regular security forces. You had private security forces and others who were carrying weapons, and I was very worried that there would be a breakout of gun violence. Luckily we were saved that. Unfortunately we weren't saved this terrorist attack by a murderous member of a group whose ideology is based on violence. This hatred-filled ideology that would deny certain classes of citizens their right to exist, their basic fundamental rights. And let there be no doubt that these folks came to Charlottesville intent on spurring violence, which is a key part of who they are.
How close were you, Brennan, to the actual car assault?
I was about an arm's length away from the car. I jumped out of the way. I was in the middle of the street, pulled back when it went by, got a clear vision of the driver's head. He had, unfortunately, tinted windows, so I couldn't clearly see him except that he was a white male. But yeah, he narrowly missed me and then went, and I witnessed something that no one should have to see.
Were any of your friends hit by that car?
I don't believe any of my close friends were hit by the cars. Just, brothers and sisters in solidarity with standing up to these racists who have absolutely no place in our society.
As you know, President Trump, he condemned hate and bigotry, but he failed to specifically call out the white nationalists, the neo-Nazis. I want you to listen to this for a moment.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. on many sides.
What were your thoughts after you heard this from the president and after specifically seeing the violence firsthand?
I think the president's had a failure of leadership. I preferred the statement that former Vice President Joe Biden made, and that is that there was one side here. There is the side of right, there's the side of justice, there's the side of love, and on the other side we had a hatred-filled group who was intent on violence, and there can't be any seat for this kind of violence at the table.
Brendan Gilmore, fortunately you're okay. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wolf.
The vice mayor of Charlottesville is urging the city to stand together against all the hate groups. So we're going to hear him in his own words when he joins us. That's coming up.
Aaron Burnett out front. Stories that matter.
You've got the money and you've got the passion, but how do you actually make a difference?
From the people making headlines.
49 other states. If there's going to be pain, let's share it. 49 other states. We've had enough.
Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia, thanks very much. David Swerdlick, Jay Newton-Small, appreciate it very much. The Department of Justice here in Washington has now opened a civil rights investigation into that deadly car assault yesterday during this weekend's protests in Charlottesville. Up next, we're going to speak to a former lawyer from that division. We're going to find out exactly all of the late-breaking developments in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the Department of Justice here in Washington has now opened a formal civil rights investigation into that deadly car attack. 32-year-old Heather Heyer was killed when a car plowed into a crowd of protesters rallying against the white supremacist rally on Saturday. Dozens of other people were injured. Several of them remain in critical condition right now. I want to bring in Laura Coates. She's a CNN legal analyst, former attorney in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Laura, what does that mean that a civil rights investigation has now been launched?
So now they're trying to figure out whether or not any federal charges can be applied to this conduct, whether or not there is a racially motivated bias or other bias or perhaps an ideological one, and figuring out if there is a criminal statute that could actually hook into a federal statute to prosecute the person under a federal legislative act. And so they're trying to figure out, look, what did his social media look like? Did he have any manifestos perhaps? Did you have any friends that you knew of that you talked to about your intentions of this day? Was there an element of premeditation here? They're going to do a comprehensive look at who this person is, what the motive was, and if the motive is one that hooks to a criminal statute, they will attach it.
So what would be the difference between a civil rights investigation and a formal terrorism investigation, concluding this was allegedly an act of terror?
Well, they've been very difficult trying to ascertain what's the distinction between a hate crime and terrorism. Oftentimes people look at them as very synonymous terms, but legally speaking, terrorist has to do with the act of trying to influence a civilian population or the government through mass destruction, assassination, through kidnapping, through other acts. And so you have to have an ideological slant behind it. A hate crime usually is tied to a bias other than ideology, race, religion, perceived gender identity, or perception of any of the things I just named. And so that hook is more of a bias as opposed to an ideological concern.
So the federal government is now investigating James Alex Fields Jr., 20-year-old from Ohio, who drove to this rally, and he's now been charged with what, second-degree murder?
Yes, among other things. He has
by
also...
the state?
By the state. So the state has its own probe they're going to be doing and can attach to the homicide case, essentially. Then you've got the issue of what the federal agents will look at in terms of whether there's a federal law that's been violated. They can both have a simultaneous probe. You saw this in Dylan Roof, for example, of the case that happened just a few years back. Happens in other cases as well. But right now, the state's focusing on the actual homicide. The feds will focus on more so whether there was a larger plot that was awry, that was intending to do something more, or if there was attached to a motive or bias. But right now, you've got this man who's open to not only second-degree murder, which of course is this total disregard for human life, kind of like shooting a gun into a crowd of people, not knowing if anyone would be impacted or affected, and just having that disregard. But you could also have a bias attached to it. Was he trying to attack a certain type of person? Was there a profile that he was trying to harm? And then you've got this area of transferred intent that says, look, even if the person you were intending to actually hurt was not who you ultimately ended up hurting, you can still have those penalties attached in that respect as well.
Senator Ted Cruz, he called on the Justice Department to immediately investigate and prosecute today's grotesque act of domestic terrorism. Who would have priority, now the federal government or the state, in going after this individual?
Well, if it's national security, that's when terrorism comes in. Then you have the priority of the federal government at that respect. And you can still have this state investigation going on. That can still be happening. But the priority would then go to, if it's domestic terrorism, which a lot of people think it is, because it does have that connection. It does have the potential for mass destruction. And it's an issue not just of semantics, but really the trend over the past 10 years or more has been to focus on the perpetrator of the crime to then define terrorism. But in reality, the codes do not require that. This actually could be that. So the feds will have priority, and we'll see how that plays out.
There is a death penalty in Virginia, as well as the federal government potentially is at stake.
Absolutely. You know, mind you, hate crimes do have enhancements attached to them as well. You would not have the person going free if it wasn't called terrorism. I think, honestly, people want the semantics to be part of the argument, and for good reason.
Laura Coates, as usual, thanks very much.
Will.
Excellent explanation. Appreciate it.
Thank you
very much. We're going to have much more ahead here in the CNN newsroom, and it all starts right now.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington. Frederica Whitfield is off. Charlottesville, Virginia, on edge once again right now as protesters shouted down a white supremacist leader just in the last hour trying to hold a press conference. Our Brian Todd is on the scene for us. We're going to get the very latest from him in just a moment. We also just learned the identity of the woman killed in that horrific car assault. She is 32-year-old Heather Heyer, a paralegal from Virginia. Also today, the Department of Justice here in Washington formally opening an investigation into the deadly assault and the violent clashes that have left more than 30 people injured. Many of them remain in critical condition right now. Today, Virginia's Governor Terry McAuliffe issued me from all sides of the political spectrum for what he said about the Charlottesville violence and what he didn't say. This morning, the president came under fire for not calling the attacks domestic terrorism and for not specifically criticizing the white nationalists, the far-right hate groups that took part in that violent rally.
And I encourage the president to do that. This president has done so when people have driven trucks through crowds in Europe. He's called it radical Islamic terrorism. He should use this opportunity today to say this is terrorism, this is domestic terrorism, this is white nationalism, and it has to stop.
Well, it's an act of domestic terrorism, and the groups you just mentioned are hate-filled groups. They're enemies of freedom. When it comes to President Trump, I'm with Corey Gardner. He missed an opportunity to be very explicit here. These groups seem to believe they have a friend in Donald Trump in the White House. I don't know why they believe that, but they don't see me as a friend in the Senate. And I would urge the president to dissuade these groups that he's their friend.
This is not hard. There's two words that need to be said over and over again: domestic terrorism and white supremacy. That is exactly what we saw on display this weekend, and we just aren't seeing leadership from the White House.
Well, the president's been very clear. We cannot tolerate this kind of bigotry, this kind of hatred. And what he did is he called on all Americans to take a firm stand against it. This is a great opportunity for us to ask ourselves, what are we teaching our children?
I think he needed to be much harsher as it related to the white supremacists and the nature of that. I applaud General McMaster for calling it out for what it is. It's actually terrorism, and whether it's domestic or international terrorism, with the moral authority of the presidency, you have to call that stuff out.
All right, let's discuss all of this. Larry Sabato is joining us. He's the director for the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. David Swerdlick is a CNN political commentator. He's the assistant editor of the Washington Post. And Jay Newton Small is a contributor for Time magazine. Larry, should the president come out even now, a day late, and publicly disavow these white supremacist groups?
A day late and a dollar short, sure, but he missed his moment, Wolf. It was yesterday. And those moments don't come around very often. It was so easy, so obvious. As you just saw all of those Republican senators say, and loads of others besides, like Marco Rubio, John McCain, Rob Portman, it was so easy. He couldn't even do the easy thing because he didn't want to do the easy thing. Those white supremacists and white nationalists are part of his base, and he knows it.
Yeah, I'm surprised he hasn't even retweeted his daughter Ivanka's tweet, which specifically went after these white supremacist groups. Larry, you've studied this president for a long time now. Explain that. Why doesn't he do that?
Why did he not say something more definitive or not retweet?
Yes, specifically condemn by name these white supremacist neo-Nazi groups. Why doesn't he do that?
Because it was a wink and a nod to them. They did support him. Now, no one knows what their real numbers are. I've got to be honest, I was kind of shocked at the large number that I saw personally on Friday night going right by my home on the University of Virginia lawn. A lot of them were there, but we don't know what the percentage is. But the way Trump looks at it, these were hardcore supporters, and they say that. They say they were inspired by Trump. They say they were energized by Trump. And so he doesn't want to turn that off. At the same time, he doesn't want to alienate anybody else. So he tried this ridiculous formulation about many groups were responsible. Many things were done poorly, spreading out the blame and this ridiculous equivalency, moral equivalency. It doesn't work with the large majority who didn't vote for him, but these are subliminal messages he's constantly sending to that disreputable part of his base.
Yeah, in his original statement, Jay, he said he condemns in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides, And those words, on many sides, they clearly seem to be suggesting moral equivalency, and that has generated so much anger.
Absolutely, Wolf, and it's really striking here to see Republicans of this party really strike out against him. Cory Gardner is one, as you heard. Lindsey Graham is another. Orrin Hatch, whose brother died fighting Nazis. Ted Cruz. I mean, these are people who, in recent months, have really taken sort of not to criticizing Trump, but sort of letting him have this. I mean, this honeymoon period, you could say, and I think you can clearly say now the honeymoon period is over. Republicans feel very, very comfortable and confident in criticizing their own president and saying he's not doing something we want the party to be seen doing, and we want him to change course.
His daughter is Jewish, Ivanka Trump. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is Jewish. You'd think he would have a responsibility to speak out against the racism, the anti-Semitism that clearly was prevalent.
Right, well, he has that personal motivation, but then he also has the responsibility as President of the United States. And as Larry said, it should be easy for a president to first denounce the racist, disgusting, un-American views of white nationalists and white supremacists, and then if he wants, then pivot to this idea of violent versus nonviolent protest, or this idea of free speech, or this idea of whatever equivalence he wants to do on the two sides. But when he conflated those things in one short statement, he made it seem like there was that moral equivalence between the two sides, and that's why he's getting so much pushback, and that's why so many people in his party are breaking from him on this.
And a lot of people remember, David, a year ago plus, when it took him a while to condemn David Duke and white supremacists. All of us remember that interview he did with Jake Tapper, in which he said, I don't know anything about David Duke.
It took him a while. He looked pained to eventually disavow David Duke. There was the episode where he blamed Judge Gonzalo Curiel for being Mexican-American. There was the birtherism that sort of launched his political incarnation in the last several years. The president now, if he wanted to pivot away from that, he's struggling to do it because it's hard to turn that ship around once you've unleashed it.
This is also a man who, remember, back in the 1990s, took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times calling for the death penalty for the alleged Central Park rapists who turned out to be exonerated. They turned out to be innocent. And so he has a long history here of people saying that of doing things that people perceive as racist. And
so how does he fix this, Larry? You studied politics for a long time. You studied presidents for a long time. You're an expert. How does he fix this at this point? He clearly needs to do something.
Well, he can certainly come out with a new statement. Far better would be if he found a way to part company with Steve Bannon and some of the other people who have sympathies in the white nationalist direction and have a history of it. This would be a great time to do it. I think General Kelly wants to get rid of some of them. Maybe he can move into this vacuum and push them out. That would help. But you know, Wolf, we now know Donald Trump all too well from the campaign and the first 6 months of his presidency. This guy's not going to change. He's just not going to change. He plays to his base constantly. It was enough to get him elected, barely, last November, and I think he thinks it's enough to get him reelected.
What do you think? You think that this is all about politics? Is that what you think?
I think it's about a few things. Well, I think, first of all, it's a failure of leadership, right? The president has gotten to where he is in life by aggrandizing himself. That is something he is good at. He has not really ever succeeded in building bridges and bringing people together for the greater good. So you saw him yesterday. Just look at his body language from that clip when he was speaking at the press conference yesterday. He struggles to do this where he doesn't struggle to criticize people.
But his entire candidacy has always been about us versus them, right? And the us, to some degree, has always been let us protect you from those evil immigrants. Let us protect you from those radical Islamist terrorists who are going to do us harm. And us has always been, to some degree, the white Americans. And so for him to now turn and say, well, those white Americans might be danger too, that they might be something to be feared, I think is a hard pivot for him.
Larry, in his remarks on the protest that he delivered yesterday, the president said, and I'm quoting him now, we must cherish our history. Cherish our history. Some, including former Congressman Tom Perriello of Virginia, thought this was a nod to Charlottesville's attempt to remove the Confederate statue of Robert E. Lee in your city in Charlottesville. Do you agree?
I do. I think that was exactly what he hoped people would interpret from it, or maybe the staff member who wrote it. I don't know, but yes, that's the message. And also, the white nationalists want to keep talking about the statue of Robert E. Lee. Believe me, Wolf, this was just the pretext for everything they did. They look for these opportunities so they can spend a few days in the hot lights, the wonderful warm lights of the national media, getting all of their messages of hate across. And boy, did they succeed, unfortunately, here in Charlottesville.
All asking here as well, Wolf, no answer so far. It seems to me that, or it seems to many of us, that if the White House is trying to perhaps clean this up a bit, seeing the reaction that the president's remarks got yesterday, that they would go further and at least attach someone's name to it, because it has more force that way. This is really what it all comes down to. This is why there's so much criticism of President Trump himself, because it's a bully pulpit for a reason, a lot of folks would say, and they argue that the president isn't showing leadership. He talks about wanting to unite the country, to bring people together, and yet won't specifically talk about the facts on the ground that led to the violence we saw unfolding on the streets of Charlottesville yesterday. So it is curious to have this White House official not wanting to put their name to this statement.
Well, very curious indeed. But if the president does want to make a statement, of course, all the major TV networks, all the cable networks, we will be there. We'll have live coverage of any statement that the president is ready to make if he decides in the coming hours to go before the cameras, as so many people, including many Republicans, are strongly urging him to do. The fact he hasn't done it yet, raising a lot more questions. Athena, we'll get back to you as soon as you get word if the president will make a statement. We'll get right back to you as well. Thanks very, very much. Coming up, we're going to speak to someone on the ground in Charlottesville, Virginia, who was at the rally and saw a former Ku Klux Klan leader speak out, what he witnessed, and his thoughts on what happened. We'll take a quick break. Our special coverage continues. Protesters, one woman was killed after a car rammed into a large crowd. All told, the violence already has left more than 30 other people injured. I want to bring in Tim Dotson from Charlottesville. He's the managing editor of the University of Virginia student newspaper, the Cavalier Daily. Tim, thanks very much for joining us. So tell us exactly what you saw yesterday.
Yeah, so yesterday we got to Emancipation Park, which is where the Unite the Right rally, the alt-right rally, was planned. Before the rally could even start at 12, police had declared an unlawful assembly, so they were not able to gather at the park. But even before the rally was scheduled to start, counter-protesters, demonstrators, there was a lot of chaos downtown. There were chemical irritants in the air. I was choking on it, so were some other members of my reporting team. So it was a very tense situation and chaotic situation in downtown Charlottesville. Shortly after that unlawful assembly was declared, it seemed that a lot of members of the alt-right were moving over towards McIntyre Park, so it's a little bit away from the downtown area. They were starting to gather over there, so we headed over there, and shortly after we got there, a few other leaders of the alt-right, specifically Richard Spencer and David Duke, were there, and they addressed some of their supporters at McIntyre Park. There were quite a few dozen of them.
I want you to listen because we have a
when
clip.
they were-
Tim, listen to David Duke addressing the crowd. Here's a little bit of what he said.
We are determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back, and that's what we got to do.
All right, so Tim, describe that moment for us.
Well, I think standing there, they were standing on top of a picnic table, so they were surrounded by several dozen other white nationalists. But it was a very chaotic scene, to say the least. Afterwards, during David Duke's speech, actually, there were several counter demonstrators who showed up at McIntyre Park and were, starting to protest and, yell some slogans. And so there was some sort of infighting happening. There was a lot of verbal disagreements happening, and that verbal tension then became physical after most of the crowd had cleared out. Didn't look like anything too serious in terms of physical harm, but quickly people moved out of McIntyre Park. So it was, again, I would describe yesterday as chaotic in Charlottesville.
School isn't back in session yet, the University of Virginia, world-class university, but how would the atmosphere have been different if the students were actually there?
I mean, there's still some students on grounds here for the summer, so I think obviously it's a scary situation for a lot of them who are here. But I can't predict what this would have been like had students been on grounds, had this happened during while school was in session. But again, it's a very tense situation, and you also see a lot of student groups at UVA responding to this, denouncing it, they're reacting in a variety of ways. So I think that this conversation will continue to go on moving forward. And again, on Friday night we had a torch-lit march that went through our campus, and then that surrounded the statue of Thomas Jefferson. There were counter demonstrators there, and again, another chaotic scene. I think a lot of students were pretty scared.
In the speeches and the chanting and the slogans you heard, the hate out there, was it mostly racist, anti-Semitic, white supremacist? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, at the march, there were a variety of things they were saying. One thing they said is, whose streets are streets, as if they were taking something back here in Charlottesville. We have to remember that some of this is about the statue of Robert E. Lee over in Lee Park, or now called Emancipation Park, and there's been a lot of tension about whether or not the city should remove those statues. City Council voted earlier this year in favor of removing the statue of Robert E. Lee, but that is currently involved in a pending litigation, so that question hasn't been decided about whether or not the city can remove those statues. But that was one of the slogans I was hearing. Another one was I think it was like, we will not be defeated, things like that. In terms of yesterday, David Duke, when he was speaking, and Richard Spencer, both of them referenced local officials, including Mayor Michael Signer. He's a Jewish man, and they made anti-Semitic comments while David Duke and Richard Spencer were speaking, directed at the mayor.
Interesting. All right, it's pretty sad, I should say. Tim Dodson, the editor of the student newspaper at the University of Virginia. Tim, thanks very much. We'll stay in close touch with you as well. I want to go back to CNN's Brian Todd. He's on the scene for us in Charlottesville. Brian, you're in the middle of a protest that seems to be popping up right now. What can you tell us?
Yeah, well, this is kind of an impromptu protest by counter-protesters who showed up here to counter what Jason Kessler, the right-wing, white supremacist leader, was going to say at a news conference that he wanted to hold over here. He had set up a position over here right next to City Hall. He had microphones set up, TV station microphones set up over here. He did show up, and people started to kind of shout at him and shout him down. He did start to speak for about a few minutes, but our teams couldn't really hear what he was saying. People were shouting at him. People were playing musical instruments to try to drown him out. So essentially, his message at least wasn't heard by many people. We had teams here watching and listening to what he had to say, and nobody could really hear him. Then the crowd started to kind of converge on Jason Kessler. He apparently went down. Not clear whether he slipped or he was pushed, but the police at that point kind of interceded ostensibly for his own safety, and escorted him around the building to where I'm taking you now. This is the City Hall building here in Charlottesville. The entrance to the police station is just up here. I can go a few more feet here and just tell you where we believe Jason Kessler may be. He may be in this building now, unless they've gotten him out. Now, they did bring a couple of police vehicles here to try to take someone out, but it's not clear if they ever did take anyone out. He was escorted by several riot police officers, dozens of them, kind of hurriedly escorted him around the block and got him into an entrance just up there. So we believe he is still, sorry officer, we believe he's still in the building, but we're not sure about that. But clearly things got pretty dangerous for him. The police were worried about his safety, got him out of here very quickly. He came here to give some kind of message. We may never know what that message was going to be, Wolf.
All right, Brian, we'll stay very, very close touch with you. Be careful over there. Brian